I did it. It was me. I killed him.
Take your time. Just tell me what happened.
I didn't mean for it to go that far.
A case that shocked the entire Philippines. It stemmed from a compassionate decision made by a mother. A horrific crime occurred right inside the very home that was supposed to be the safest place. But what makes this case truly haunting is not just the crime scene, but the true identity of the perpetrator. And when the truth was revealed, it was more terrifying than any theory. This was a quiet residential area in the Philippines, where life moved at a familiar and steady pace. The streets were not too crowded, the houses were close enough for people to recognize their neighbors, and the afternoons passed by with almost nothing unusual happening. In places like this, safety did not need to be mentioned. It was almost taken for granted. People believed that simply closing the door and staying inside their own home was enough to separate themselves from any danger outside. That is why, when the case occurred, it did not only shock people because of its severity, but also shattered a fundamental belief that there are places where one can feel completely secure, because in this case, the danger did not come from outside but emerged from within the very space that everyone believed to be the safest. And to understand what truly happened inside that house, we need to start with the family who lived there, a family that, from the outside, seemed to have no reason at all to become the victims of such a crime. The Maguad family had long been seen as an ideal model in the eyes of those around them, not because of wealth or prominence, but because of the way they built a stable, principled life closely tied to the value of education. The father was a teacher, accustomed to imparting knowledge, but at the same time carried within him the calmness and responsibility of someone who always had to set an example. He was described as this. The mother, in her role as a principal, was not only a pillar in her work, but also the one who kept the rhythm of the entire family. She was accustomed to managing, organizing, and caring, and that was also reflected in the way she built a neat, orderly home where everything had order and meaning. Their two children grew up in that very environment, and each of them carried a distinct personality while clearly reflecting the foundation they were raised with. Gwen, the 18-year-old older sister, was a typical image of maturity and compassion. She not only did well academically, but was also always willing to help others, especially those less fortunate than herself. She was even the one who proactively connected with Janice, an orphan girl with an extremely pitiful background, and persuaded her parents to adopt her, a decision that stemmed from deep empathy. Gwen was often described as someone who was caring, a good listener, and always tried to do the right thing, even when it required sacrifice. Louis, the 16-year-old younger brother, had a different personality, more reserved and quieter, yet very affectionate and deeply connected to his family. He was not someone who stood out in a loud way, but rather someone who was consistently present in a stable and reliable manner. Louis tended to keep things within a safe boundary, preferred familiar routines, and had a special attachment to his living space. Friends and relatives described him as gentle and always well-mannered. And then, within that family, a new member appeared, Janice, the 17-year-old adopted daughter. She came from an unstable past, having experienced deprivation both materially and emotionally. Being adopted was not only a change in living environment, but also an opportunity to start over, to become part of a real family. In the first few months, Janice seemed to integrate well. She lived with the family, studied, and carried out daily activities like a normal member. From the outside, this family showed almost no signs of any fracture. No conflicts, no public pressure, no clear reason for them to become the target of a tragedy. They were the kind of family people believed would always be safe, where everything was on the right track, where the future seemed to be arranged in a calm and certain way. And perhaps that is exactly why this case became harder to accept than anything else. Because when everything on the outside appears so perfect that there is nothing suspicious, the most frightening part lies in this. The answer does not come from what we can see, but from what had been quietly unfolding inside, where no one truly paid attention until everything was already too late. On the afternoon of December 10th, 2021, in a quiet residential area in Cotabato Province, Philippines, everything began to change in a way that was very difficult to notice at that moment. At around nearly 3 p.m., a neighbor passed by the Maguad family's house as usual. There were no clear signs of any incident, but something made them stop, a kind of stillness that was unlike any other day. The house, which normally had the familiar sounds of daily life, was now completely silent, even though it was known that the children had been home earlier. That feeling was not enough to draw any specific conclusion, but it was enough to create an uneasiness that was hard to ignore. The neighbor did not enter the house, but decided to call the father to inform him that something was not right. The call happened quickly, just a brief warning, but it was enough to catch the father's attention. Immediately, the father tried to contact the children at home. No one answered. He called back several times, but there was still no response. The prolonged, unusual silence made him begin to worry. He quickly called his wife, who was on a business trip at the time, saying that something was not right, and at the same time immediately left the school to head home. The strange thing was that there had been no call at all from the children reporting anything unusual happening, which made the father even more uneasy on his way back home. And what no one realized at that moment was this: when the call was made, when the attempts to reach them began in vain, inside that house, everything was no longer as it had been before. The father returned home, and the moment he stopped in front of the door, he immediately realized that something was wrong, not from inside, but from what was right before his eyes. A blood-stained blanket lay on the ground at the entrance, and right next to it was a knife left behind. Two details that did not belong to a normal afternoon and were enough for him to understand that this was no longer a simple situation. He called out to his children, but there was no response. The unusually prolonged silence made the surrounding space feel heavier. Without hesitation, he quickly moved to the back door to enter the house. As soon as he stepped inside, he noticed that the familiar space had completely changed. Furniture was disturbed. Many items were no longer in their original places, but this disorder did not resemble a typical burglary. It looked more like a scene that had just gone through a chaotic incident. He continued calling his children's names as he moved into the living room, and then he saw Gwen lying motionless on the floor. That moment nearly brought everything to a halt, because he understood that this was no longer a situation that could be controlled. Not far from there, near the main entrance, he discovered his son Louis in a similar condition. These two discoveries, made within a very short span of time, were enough to confirm that this was not an accident, but a serious incident that had just occurred. However, there was still one person unaccounted for: Janice. In a state of panic, he began searching throughout the house, repeatedly calling her name, checking every room in urgency and tension. Finally, Janice came out from one of the rooms, visibly terrified, almost unable to speak. The father immediately embraced her, the only one left, and called the police. When the authorities arrived, they entered a space that was no longer a home in the true sense, but a scene with many signs indicating that a serious incident had taken place in a very short period of time. And from that moment on, that house officially became a crime scene. The police immediately arrived, and investigators approached the scene with the assumption that this was an organized break-in, a familiar scenario when a house shows signs of disturbance and there are fatalities inside. However, after a careful examination, each small detail began to gradually dismantle that assumption. First, there were no signs indicating any forced entry from the outside. The main door was determined to be locked from the inside, and other entry points showed no signs of being broken or tampered with. This almost completely ruled out the possibility that the perpetrator was an outsider who broke in and then left. Next, when checking the property inside the house, the police noticed that there were no signs of significant loss. Valuable items were still intact, with no indication that anything had been taken. This did not align with a typical burglary. More importantly, the way the scene had been disturbed also raised many questions. The rooms showed signs of being rummaged through, but not following any clear logic of searching for valuables. This disorder appeared to have been deliberately created to mislead the investigation rather than being the result of an actual theft. In addition, the weapons found at the scene were not tools brought in from outside, but were all items already available within the house itself, a detail of critical significance in the investigation. Specifically, authorities determined that multiple types of weapons had been used, including a knife with a broken handle and a blade still bearing traces, a machete commonly used in daily household activities, a baseball bat that had been kept in a bedroom, and a hammer used for home repairs. Furthermore, shards of broken glass found at the scene were also believed to have been used as improvised tools to inflict injuries during the incident. The presence of multiple weapons indicated that the act did not occur in a single impulsive moment, but involved continuous switching of tools, reflecting a level of control over the situation and the ability to utilize the surrounding environment. More notably, according to the father's statement, some items such as the hammer had been stored in relatively hidden places, not something just anyone would know, which further reinforced the assessment that the perpetrator was deeply familiar with the living space and knew the exact locations of objects within the house. Another detail that drew particular attention from investigators was that the washing machine in the house had been used, yet no corresponding clean clothes were found. This created a clear logical gap. If the washing machine had been running, then the clothes should have appeared afterward, but in reality, there were not. From this, investigators formed the hypothesis that the use of the washing machine was not for normal household purposes, but could have been an action carried out after the incident ended, aimed at handling or reducing any remaining traces. This was a small detail but carried strong indicative value, as it showed that there were not only actions during the commission of the crime, but also steps taken afterward to manage the scene. When all of these factors were placed together, the direction of the investigation had to change completely. Instead of continuing to search for an outsider, investigators began narrowing the focus to those directly connected to the house, people who understood the living space, daily routines, and especially those who were present at the scene at the time the incident occurred. At this point, a disturbing possibility gradually became clear. The perpetrator did not need to break in, because they had been inside the house from the very beginning. As the direction of the investigation changed, Janice's role in the case also shifted in a very clear way. She was no longer viewed simply as the sole survivor of an attack, but became the most crucial link in explaining what had truly happened inside that house. In the initial interviews, Janice maintained her original account. She claimed that a group of strangers had broken in, acted quickly, unexpectedly, and in an organized manner, then left within a short period of time. According to her, everything happened so fast that she had no time to react, forcing her to hide in a room and could only wait in a state of panic. On the surface, this account aligned with the image of a survivor of an attack. However, as investigators began to analyze more deeply and place that statement alongside the evidence collected at the scene, inconsistencies gradually began to emerge. A major issue appeared in Janice's statement that investigators could not ignore. She said that when the incident happened, she was so frightened that she ran to her room, locked the door, and hid inside. However, when the scene was examined, her room was found to be in a ransacked state, with belongings unusually disturbed. This immediately created a clear contradiction. If she had stayed inside the room to hide, why did that space show signs of being interfered with in such a way? Not stopping there, Janice also stated that Lewis was the first to be attacked, but forensic results and evidence at the scene indicated that Gwen was actually the first victim. The inconsistency between her statement and the physical evidence led the police to begin seriously questioning her account. Investigators continued working with the father and, from that, uncovered further inconsistencies in Janice's statements. Earlier, she had said that her phone was not working at the time of the incident, but the father confirmed that he had called and her phone was still ringing with no one answering. When questioned again, Janice changed her statement, saying that she was in the bathroom at the time and did not hear the call. These adjustments made her account even more inconsistent. The father also provided important information related to the items in the house. One of the objects used in the incident was a baseball bat, which belonged to Lewis and was usually kept on the top bunk of the bed. After Janice moved in with the family, she was the one using that bed position and had direct access to this item. In addition, a hammer was also identified as a household tool, typically kept by the father behind the washing machine, and only 3 people knew its location: him, Gwen, and Janice. These details indicated that the person who carried out the act had a clear understanding of the space and the items within the house. Another witness, a delivery driver, also provided notable information. He stated that he had arrived to deliver an order at the house before the neighbor called the father. No one came out to receive it, but he saw someone inside a girl who briefly appeared and then quickly left. Although he could not confirm her identity, this detail made the suspicion that Janice was present and moving around inside the house at that time even clearer. The key factor in the entire case was the condition of the main door, which was locked from the inside with no signs of being forced open. This almost confirmed that the person responsible was someone who had a key, someone who had already been inside the house, and then locked the door afterward. When combined with the other evidence, the pool of suspects was narrowed down to only 3 people: the father, who had a clear alibi, the mother, who was away on a business trip, and Janice, who was the only person present at the scene. However, since Janice was only 17 years old, the legal handling had to comply with regulations for minors. The police could not proceed with an arrest without sufficient direct evidence, so she was placed under the supervision of social welfare authorities while the investigation continued to expand. By December 15th, Janice's fingerprints were found on items related to the incident. This was an important discovery, but not enough to charge her, since she lived in the house and the presence of her fingerprints on these objects could have come from daily activities. At the same time, a new detail caused the case to take a different turn. In Janice's room, the mother discovered a COVID contact tracing form with a QR code, but the name on it was not Janice's. It belonged to a 17-year-old teenager, an acquaintance of hers from the orphanage. This very detail opened up an entirely new direction in the investigation, suggesting that the have involved Janice alone, but could also have included the involvement of another person. The clue from the COVID contact tracing form quickly led the police to focus their attention on Ando, a teenager who had a past connection with Janice. From there, they began reviewing witnesses around the area at the time the incident occurred, and the statements collected gradually reinforced this suspicion. One neighbor reported seeing a young man near the house on that very day, while another recalled that a teenage boy had asked for directions to the Maguad family's home that morning. When shown images, this person confirmed that it was Ando. Another statement even suggested that Janice had been seen being dropped off near the house shortly before the incident, raising the possibility that she was not entirely inside the house, as she had initially claimed. These details caused the investigation to shift in an entirely new direction, no longer the hypothesis of a lone perpetrator, but the possibility of coordination between multiple individuals. Just one day later, on December 16th, Janice gave a confession to her lawyer. In this statement, she admitted that she was not a victim, but someone who had directly participated in the crime together with Ando. According to her, the act stemmed from emotions that had built up over a long period: jealousy, a sense of inferiority, and a desire to receive all the affection from her adoptive parents. In her perception, the 2 biological children in the family were the biggest obstacles preventing her from achieving that. Janice described that she always felt she stood outside a true place in the family, even though everything seemed normal on the surface. These emotions were not clearly expressed, but accumulated over time and gradually turned into resentment. The idea of replacing Gwen's position as the only child was formed from that. To her, removing the other 2 meant gaining the complete attention she had always longed for. By December 18th, Janice officially gave a confession to the police, although her statement still contained some inconsistencies. Shortly after, Ando was arrested after voluntarily turning himself in. At the investigation agency, Ando also admitted his involvement in the case, and subsequent forensic results confirmed that biological traces on clothing discarded near the scene matched him. Since both were under 18 years old at the time of the crime, they were transferred to social welfare authorities in accordance with Philippine law, instead of being processed immediately through the regular detention system. This meant that many details of the confession were not widely disclosed, even to the victim's family. Meanwhile, an unexpected development occurred in a completely unrelated case. During another inspection, the police discovered a phone that matched the device of one of the victims. After checking the serial number, they confirmed that it was the phone that had been taken after the incident. Through the investigation, the police determined that Janice did not directly handle the disposal of the device, but had asked Ando to take care of it. However, the device had been severely damaged due to water exposure, making all the data inside unrecoverable. The person found in possession of the phone was determined to have no connection to the case, only someone who had purchased it without knowing its origin. Although confessions had been made and the evidence began to support a clearer scenario, many details of the case were not fully disclosed. Part of this was due to legal regulations related to the protection of minors, leaving the overall picture of the case with gaps that have yet to be fully filled. As the investigation continued to progress, Janice gradually stopped cooperating entirely with the authorities, making many details of the case more difficult to clarify. In a later interview with the media, the adoptive mother shared that she was deeply shocked upon learning the truth, but in hindsight, she realized there had been unusual signs earlier that the family either did not recognize in time or chose to overlook. At first, everything seemed to go smoothly, and Janice adapted well to her new life. But over time, certain concerning behaviors began to appear. Around August 2021, when the family was facing difficulties due to a relative being hospitalized with COVID-19, a sum of money kept in the house for emergencies went missing. At the time, Janice explained that there had been a break-in, but just one day later, the money was found among her personal belongings. Although she admitted the act, the family still chose to forgive her, partly because they believed that her difficult past experiences had affected her behavior, and also because Gwen was the one who stood up to ask that she be given another chance. However, in the months that followed, Janice's behavior continued to change in a more negative direction. She became irresponsible, no longer carried out her daily tasks, and although she often apologized when reminded, there were no real signs of change. One detail that later made the family reflect deeply was that on the very morning of the day the incident occurred, Janice called her adoptive parents, dad, and mom for the first time using forms of address she had never used before. In hindsight, this action was seen as an unusual psychological sign, as if she had been preparing for something. As the case spread across social media, many people began to look more deeply into Janice's past. One notable piece of information was discovered from a missing child notice in 2013, which recorded that a girl around 7 to 8 years old had been found alone on a boat in the Cotabato area, unable to remember her family or address. That child was later placed into the welfare system. However, after the case occurred, Janice's biological family confirmed that she was not an orphan as previously claimed. She was born in 2005, the youngest of 3 children in her family, but her childhood was affected by a broken family situation due to personal issues between her parents. The siblings were separated and lived in different environments. Although she had once reunited with her biological family for a period of time, Janice later cut off contact, reportedly because she believed her family could not provide her with a better life. One detail that drew strong emotion was that Janice's biological mother attended the victim's funeral, expressing grief and offering an apology, while the victim's family, despite their great loss, still hoped that Janice would cooperate and tell the truth if she still had a sense of responsibility. However, when this mother tried to meet her daughter at the welfare center, she was not allowed to do so due to insufficient documentation to prove their relationship. At the same time, other pieces of information continued to surface during the investigation and on social media, including messages believed to be from Janice prior to the incident, reflecting negative thoughts and a desire to change her circumstances through extreme means. Although not all of this information was officially confirmed, it contributed to revealing the complex psychological picture of the suspect before the incident occurred. When all of these factors are put together, the case is no longer just a single act of violence, but becomes the result of multiple elements accumulating from personal circumstances and psychology to warning signs that had appeared earlier but were not recognized in time. At the trial, Janice's demeanor became one of the details that left many people shocked. She did not show clear remorse or regret, and at times even appeared indifferent when facing her adoptive parents. This created a strong contrast with the expectations of the family people who, despite having suffered an irreparable loss, stated that they were willing to forgive her if she truly recognized her wrongdoing and showed remorse. But according to them, that never happened. The adoptive father later shared candidly that he could not face Janice directly again, as he did not believe he could remain calm when standing before the person who had caused the tragedy to his own family. By August 17, 2022, the court issued its verdict. Janice received a 31-year prison sentence, while Ando received 29 years. Since both were under the age of majority at the time of the crime, they would serve their sentences in a juvenile facility until they turned 21, after which they would be transferred to the adult detention system. This decision immediately sparked significant public debate. The victim's family argued that the Philippine legal system, particularly under Republic Act 9344, remained too lenient for acts of such severity, as individuals aged 15 to 18 were not treated as adults but placed into rehabilitation programs. They called for a review of these regulations, stating that in especially serious cases, a stricter approach is necessary to ensure fairness and deterrence. What makes this case more heartbreaking than anything else lies not only in the outcome, but in what had already existed within that family before it all happened. When Janice was taken in, she did not step into a strange place, but into a home that was ready to open its arms to her. Louis, the younger brother, did not hesitate to give up his own room so she could have a better place to stay, while he quietly moved to sleep elsewhere in the house, as a natural way of accepting a new family member. Gwen, the older sister, was the one who first saw Janice, believed in her, and persistently convinced their parents to give her a chance. Not only in words, she was also the one who stayed by her side, helping, sharing, and treating Janice as a true member of the family. After everything that happened, what remained was not only the loss of 2 lives, but an unfillable void within that very family. A home that was once a place of safety and connection had now become a memory tied to a tragedy they would carry for the rest of their lives. There is no explanation that can bring things back to how they were, and no way to fully ease what has happened. But this case does not stop at being a criminal act. It opens a deeper perspective on factors that are often overlooked: small warning signs, subtle changes in behavior, negative emotions that quietly accumulate over time without being recognized or addressed in time. Sometimes, the things that seem insignificant are actually the first pieces of a much larger development. The case you have just watched is a real case, compiled by our team from the official investigation files of the Maguad family murders, which occurred on December 10, 2021, in Cotabato, Philippines. It aims to provide a clearer perspective on how evidence, psychology, and the interrogation process gradually led to the truth. In many cases, the truth does not lie in a single major detail or a dramatic moment, but in small pieces, things that may seem insignificant, yet when placed together, form the entire picture. And when all those pieces come together, there is no room left for any other explanation. One of the hardest messages this case leaves behind is this: danger does not always come from the outside. It does not always appear as an obvious threat or a stranger. Sometimes, it exists within the closest relationships, within the very space people trust the most, and only reveals itself when everything has already gone too far to be changed. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow along with us in future cases.